The following quote is often attributed to Albert Einstein. "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." While the question of what weapons will be used in World War III was one that eluded Einstein, I believe the mystery has been successfully solved by two colonels in the People's Liberation Army, which is the military wing of the Chinese Communist Party. The answer to Einstein's question can be found in the book Unrestricted Warfare, which was originally published in 1999 by the PLA's Literature and Arts Publishing House in Beijing. The two authors, Colonel Qiao Liang and Colonel Wang Jiangsui, argue that a revolution in military affairs has taken place. They summarize this revolution like so. In terms of beyond limits warfare, there is no longer any distinction between what is or is not the battlefield. Spaces in nature, including the ground, the seas, the air, and outer space are battlefields. But social spaces such as the military, politics, economics, culture, and the psyche are also battlefields. And the technological space linking these two great spaces is even more so the battlefield over which all antagonists spare no effort in contending. Warfare can be military, or it can be quasi-military, or it can be non-military. It can use violence, or it can be non-violent. It can be a confrontation between professional soldiers, or one between newly emerging forces consisting primarily of ordinary people or experts. These characteristics of beyond limits war are the watershed between it and traditional warfare, as well as the starting line for new types of warfare. How are we to understand this passage? The most parsimonious interpretation I have been able to find comes from episode 55 of the China Unscripted podcast, which features award-winning investigative journalist Joshua Phillip. Phillip has served as an advisor to military and academic institutions in the U.S. as a recognized expert on, amongst other topics, unrestricted warfare. This is how he summarizes the concept.
How do you take an entire country, when you're a communist regime that controls every single element of your society, how do you weaponize every single element of your society? That's what unrestricted warfare does.
I believe that the West is already in a hot war with the CCP. This is a conclusion I have drawn based on two factors. One, the definition of warfare as expressed in unrestricted warfare, and two, explicit actions taken by the CCP on the global stage. In other words, I am under the impression that the CCP's foreign policy is based on the concepts laid out in this book. I believe evidence for this view can be found in official CCP policy declarations, as well as in specific political actions, the full context of which can only be understood if one is familiar with how the CCP conceives of war. In the book's preface, the authors argue that the new principles of war are no longer using armed forces to compel the enemy to submit to one's will, but rather are using all means, including armed forces or non-armed forces, military and non-military, and lethal and non-lethal means to compel the enemy to accept one's interests. They expand upon this definition later on in the book. The goal of this kind of warfare will encompass more than merely using means that involve the force of arms to force the enemy to accept one's will. Rather, the goal should be to use all means whatsoever, means that involve the force of arms and means that do not involve the force of arms, means that involve military power and means that do not involve military power, means that entail casualties and means that do not entail casualties, to force the enemy to serve one's own interests. From these two excerpts, the following definition emerges. War is the process through which one forces an enemy to serve one's own interests. Another point which seems to have clearly emerged is that while the primary way through which nations have engaged in war historically has been through military interventions, today those methods are no longer the only or even the primary way that nations can force their enemies to serve their own interests. Expanding the concept of warfare to include non-military means is the core of the revolution in military thought proposed by the two colonels. Furthermore, they argue that technological innovation is the key factor pushing this development. They explain this like so. This revolution, however, will be upon us in full force soon enough. This time, technology is again running ahead of the military thinking. While no military thinker has yet put forth an extremely wide-ranging concept of the battlefield, technology is doing its utmost to extend the contemporary battlefield to a degree that is virtually infinite. There are satellites in space, there are submarines under the water, there are ballistic missiles that can reach any place on the globe, and the electronic countermeasures are even now being carried out in the invisible electromagnetic spectrum space. Even the last refuge of the human race, the inner world of the heart, cannot avoid the attacks of psychological warfare. There are nets above and snares below, so that a person has no place to flee. In the wake of the expansion of mankind's imaginative powers and his ability to master technology, the battle space is being stretched to its limits. As the arena of war has expanded, encompassing the political, economic, diplomatic, cultural, and psychological spheres, in addition to the land, sea, air, space, and electronic spheres, the interactions among all factors have made it difficult for the military sphere to serve as the automatic domain sphere in every war. War will be conducted in non-war spheres. This notion sounds strange and is difficult to accept, but more and more signs indicate that this is the trend. The era of comprehensive use of highly developed technologies has provided us with much greater room for applying wisdom and means than ancient people, so that people's dream of winning military victories in non-military spheres and winning wars with non-war means can now become reality. If we want to have victory in future wars, we must be fully prepared intellectually for this scenario. That is, to be ready to carry out a war which, affecting all areas of life of the countries involved, may be conducted in a sphere not dominated by military actions. All of these things are rendering more and more obsolete the idea of confining warfare to the military domain, and of using the number of casualties as a means of the intensity of a war. Warfare is now escaping from the boundaries of bloody massacre, and exhibiting a trend towards low casualties, or even none at all, and yet high intensity. This is information warfare, financial warfare, trade warfare, and other entirely new forms of war, new areas opened up in the domain of warfare. In this sense, there is now no domain which warfare cannot use, and there is almost no domain which does not have warfare's offensive pattern. Mankind is endowing virtually every space with battlefield significance. All that is needed is the ability to launch an attack in a certain place using certain means in order to achieve a certain goal. Thus, the battlefield is omnipresent. Just think, if it's even possible to start a war in a computer room or a stock exchange that will send an enemy country to its doom, then is there non-battle space anywhere? If that young lad setting out with his orders should ask today, where is the battlefield? The answer would be everywhere. In the past, revolutions in military affairs were preceded and defined by technological development. The invention of bronze armor and spears resulted in the infantry phalanx, which allowed the Greeks to defeat the Assyrian Empire. The inventions of bows, arrows, and saddles gave rise to cavalry tactics, which caused the emergence of the Mongol Empire. Black powder cannons eventually made castles obsolete. The invention of battleships, tanks, and airplanes were all continuations of this trend. This evolution continued all the way up to the invention of atomic bombs, which ushered in the nuclear age. Our two colonels argue that this trend is now over. What is different than in the past is that the revolution in military affairs that is coming will no longer be driven by one or two individual weapons. Given the current state of technological development, warfare will no longer primarily be defined by advancements in a single field. Warfare will instead be characterized by the development of all available means across every dimension imaginable. This begs the question, what does it mean to deploy all available means across every dimension? Or, as our two colonels would put it, what does breaking through the partition separating battlefield elements from non-battlefield elements, entail? Our authors argue that it entails the following. Warfare is no longer an activity confined only to the military sphere. The course of any war could be changed, or its outcome decided, by political factors, economic factors, diplomatic factors, cultural factors, technological factors, or other non-military factors. Although economic assistance, trade sanctions, diplomatic mediation, cultural infiltration, media propaganda, formulating and applying international rules, using United Nations resolutions, etc., belong to different domains such as politics, economics, or diplomacy, statesmen use them more and more now as standard military means. From the angle of methods, philosophical methods, technical methods, mathematical methods, scientific methods, and artistic methods are all used by humanity to bring benefit to itself. However, they can also be used as means in war. In this age, when the plethora of new technologies can in turn give rise to a plethora of new means and methods of fighting war, it would simply be senseless and a waste of effort to list all of the means and methods one by one. What is significant is that all of these war-fighting means have already begun to quietly change the view of warfare held by all of mankind. Faced with a nearly infinite diverse array of options to choose from, why do people want to enmesh themselves in a web of their own making and select and use means of warfare that are limited to the realm of force of arms and military power? Methods that are not characterized by the use of the force of arms, not by the use of military power, nor even by the presence of casualties and bloodshed, are just as likely to facilitate the successful realization of the war's goals, if not more so. As we see it, a single man-made stock crash, a single computer virus invasion, or a single rumor or scandal that results in a fluctuation of the enemy country's exchange rates, or exposes the leaders of an enemy country on the internet, all can be included in the ranks of new concept weapons. To get an idea of how these concepts are implemented in the real world, let's examine an example that I believe serves as a case study for how modern battles operating under this framework play out.
我们不承诺放弃使用武力，保留采取一切必要措施的选项。
Taiwan is, for all practical purposes, an independent, self-governed nation. They hold their own democratic elections, fund their own military, provide their own passports, have their own currency, and have embassies throughout the world. This independence, however, is not recognized by China. China claims that the island is a breakaway province, one that they seek to reinstate. China's goal in this conflict is to force the Taiwanese people to submit to the CCP's rule and officially declare themselves to be a part of China. Let's take a look at the means China is using to achieve that goal. On the military front, China is using a tactic called gray zone warfare. The following excerpt from China Uncensored explains what that entails.
It's a way for the PLA to defeat Taiwan's military without ever firing a shot. Since just mid-September, Chinese warplanes have flown more than 100 of these missions. These are missions where the PLA fly aircraft around and even into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, sometimes multiple times a day. Even though no shots are fired, Taiwan has to scramble jets each time in response. According to the Pentagon, China has more than 2,000 fighter jets, bombers, and warplanes. Taiwan only has 400. Over time, fuel costs, pilot fatigue, and wear and tear on Taiwanese aircraft will threaten the readiness of the island's air force if this pressure continues. Besides the psychological toll, gray zone warfare is also designed to enact a financial toll on the defenders. The numbers we're talking about here are insane. In October, Taiwan's defense minister said they had to scramble their air force nearly 3,000 times in 2020. That cost $900 million.
Because this tactic involves a military operation, it's easily recognized as a hostile action. This, however, is just one of the fronts in China's unrestricted warfare against Taiwan. Another tactic that would be hard to recognize as a hostile action without understanding what unrestricted warfare entails is map warfare. Here is another clip from China Uncensored to explain the details.
On January 29th, we published an episode called How China is Secretly Changing Everyone's Maps. I talked about how every company that prints maps and globes inside China is forced to adhere to the Chinese government's official map designs. That means they have to include a disputed area controlled by India, Taiwan, and the so-called 9-dash line that encompasses the entire South China Sea, all as a part of the People's Republic of China. Other countries, like the US, do not recognize some of China's more outrageous territorial claims, these ones. But the Chinese regime is trying to change that. They want to change how average people in other countries perceive China's borders. A lot of maps and globes these days are made in Chinese factories. And the Communist Party is using these factories to change the designs of maps and globes exported around the world with the hope that everyone will just get used to the Chinese regime's official version and eventually accept it. Chinese state-run media acknowledge their plan explicitly. Their goal is to make the Chinese government's position on territory clear to the international community. This is what I call map warfare. The Chinese Communist Party's goal is to expand their territory not by firing bullets, but by controlling the world's digital and printed maps.
I believe this is a good example of what our two authors meant when they wrote, "Even the last refuge of the human race, the inner world of the heart, cannot avoid the attacks of psychological warfare." The goal of this operation is to control international perception by influencing what children are taught about geography in public schools. If the global perception of Taiwan is that it's merely a rogue province of China, then the international community will be less likely to get involved in the event of a Chinese invasion. Instead of recognizing the invasion for what it is, people may view the action as something analogous to the domestic disputes between Spain and Catalonia, rather than Nazi Germany's occupation of Poland. In other words, map warfare is a way for the CCP to isolate Taiwan from the global stage. Another method that China is employing to isolate Taiwan from the global stage is what our authors call supranational warfare. They explain this concept like so. "We see from history that the nation-state is the highest form of the idea of security. Nowadays, the significance of the word country, in terms of nationality or geography, is no more than a large or small link in the human society of the world village. Modern countries are affected more and more by regional or worldwide organizations, such as the European Union, ASEAN, OPEC, APEC, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the WTO, and biggest of them all, the United Nations. The curtain is now slowly falling on the era in which the final decision on victory and defeat is made by the way of state versus state tests of strength. Instead, the curtain is quietly opening on an era in which problems will be resolved and objectives achieved by using supranational means on a stage larger than the size of a country. In view of this, we list supranational combinations as being among the essential factors of warfare that exceeds limits." The world is becoming increasingly interconnected. This has led to the rise of international organizations that are only growing in global influence. The CCP has recognized that these global institutions are a potential weapon that can be used against their adversaries. I believe this is the lens through which we should view the World Health Organization's recent treatment of Taiwan. On December 31st, 2020, Taiwanese doctors reported that they had heard from Chinese doctors that medical staff that had been treating corona patients had fallen ill with the disease themselves. This is a sign of human-to-human transmission. Despite this warning, the WHO tweeted the following on January 14th. "Preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus identified in Wuhan." Chinese officials did not publicly announce any cases of human-to-human transmission until January 20th, which is nearly 3 weeks after the warning came from Taiwan. Taiwan's warning of human-to-human transmission is not the only thing the WHO has been ignoring. According to this article by Reuters, Taiwan Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Juan Wu has said that since the start of the coronavirus outbreak, Taiwan has given the WHO all the information about its cases and prevention methods. But this has never been included in the WHO's daily updated situation report. I consider this very problematic because, as the BBC reports, Taiwan is seen as one of the few places in the world which has successfully stemmed the spread of the coronavirus without resorting to draconian measures. In other words, Taiwan is one of the few countries that has not resorted to tyranny in order to deal with the virus. And yet, the information it has been providing to the WHO has not been shared with the rest of the world. All of this is because of Chinese pressure to keep Taiwan from becoming a member of the UN. This leads us to an important question. How is China able to exert this kind of influence on the WHO? Once again, China Uncensored provides us with the answer.
This is the Director General of the WHO, Tedros Adhanom, meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping 3 weeks ago. Tedros' praise of China has been so lavish, he's been featured repeatedly in Chinese state-run media. And keep in mind, Tedros was praising China's authoritarian response to the virus. At the same time, he was criticizing other countries, especially the US, for travel bans to and from China. Incidentally, Tedros was a leader in Ethiopia's Tigray People's Liberation Front. That's a wing of the ruling Marxist-rooted Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. He served the violently repressive regime as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2012 to 2016 after a stint as Health Minister. Why does China have this kind of influence over the World Health Organization? It turns out the WHO is horribly corrupt. An audit revealed there has been a surge in internal corruption allegations across the whole of the organization, with the detection of multiple schemes aimed at defrauding large sums of money from the international body. Or maybe it's because of China's role as a donor to the WHO. After this 2017 meeting between Tedros and high-level Chinese leaders, the WHO got a big new financial contribution from China. China also wants to build an $80 million headquarters for the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Guess where they want to build it? In Ethiopia. Wow, what a coincidence that that's Tedros' own country. Allegations of corruption in the WHO are nothing new. In 2017, this expose from the Associated Press found that nearly half of the WHO's $2 billion budget went to first-class airfare and five-star hotels. And get this, that doesn't include costs covered by host countries seeking to curry favor, which are off WHO's books. And if you know anything about the Chinese Communist Party and how they buy influence, it's often by spending on lavish trips.
While the CCP is leveraging its influence over global institutions to isolate Taiwan, they are also using various methods to subvert Taiwanese democracy from within. Our authors ask the following questions. During a war between two countries, can special funds be set up to exert greater influence on another country's government and legislature through lobbying? And could buying or gaining control of stocks be used to turn another country's newspapers and television stations into the tools of media warfare? I am under the impression that the answer to these questions is yes. Here is a media report from Al Jazeera explaining how this is playing out in Taiwan.
Earlier this year, thousands of Taiwanese protested against what they call red media, domestic news outlets controlled by pro-Beijing owners and accused of, if not taking their editorial orders directly from the mainland, voluntarily towing the Communist Party's line in exchange for access to the mammoth Chinese market. And there's a lot to play for right now. A presidential election is just a few months away, a showdown between a pro-independence candidate on one side and a pro-Beijing candidate on the other.
When tens of thousands of Taiwanese took to the streets earlier this year to protest the so-called red media, they had one primary target, the Want group. Based in the office behind me, Wanwan's media outlets, including its most prominent newspaper, the China Times, stand accused of serving as a media mouthpiece for China's Communist Party, pushing blatant pro-Beijing propaganda. In addition to the China Times, the Wanwan Group owns CTV and CTI TV, one of Taiwan's most widely watched TV channels. The company didn't get its start in the news business, though. It is Taiwan's largest manufacturer of rice crackers and soft drinks. For the company and its chairman Tsai Ing-wen, mainland China is not only a mega market, but one that, according to an analysis of Wanwan's financial statements, has netted them nearly 15.3 billion new Taiwanese dollars in subsidies since 2007. That makes China worth staying on good terms with.
Investors like Wanwan don't buy Taiwanese companies to generate profits. They use them as political assets in their dealings with Beijing. After Wanwan took over China Times and CTI TV, they started to avoid reporting or were at least downplaying topics that Chinese authorities find sensitive, such as Falun Gong, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Taiwanese independence movement, of course, and most recently their attitude towards this year's Hong Kong protests.
Even more telling are the stories Wanwan's media outlets do cover and how they report them. For instance, Beijing and its approach to reunification.
而如今习近平的谈话同样是对台方针的揭示，却是软硬兼施，要牢牢掌握主动权跟主导权。
Wanwan's coverage in the run-up to Taiwan's presidential election in January next year has also caught the attention of anti-red media campaigners. The incumbent president, Tsai Ing-wen, supports independence. Beijing has thrown its weight behind her opponent, Han Kuo-yu, who is more China-friendly. And across Wanwan's outlets, it's Han Kuo-yu who gets the lion's share of coverage.
There also are a number of new media, so websites and Facebook pages, that are now, through analysis, are being linked to IP addresses back in China. And these content farms, these websites, generate a lot of disinformation favoring certain candidates, but also putting President Tsai in a clear disadvantage as well. If you ask me to speculate, I would be very surprised if Beijing were not doing this, but a lot of it comes from within Taiwan as well. Now, whether all of this is actually having an impact on voter decisions is something that the entire world is in the process of learning about and assessing.
The CCP's campaign of unrestricted warfare against Taiwan encompasses many more fronts than the handful I have shown here. Furthermore, Taiwan is not the only country that is under assault from the CCP. Unrestricted warfare is a global offensive that is currently being waged against every country that does not align politically with the CCP. Unrestricted warfare is, in fact, the CCP's official foreign policy. In 2012, the Delex Consulting, Studies, and Analysis Division of Delex Systems, Inc. released the following report. The report was aimed at facilitating a better understanding of leading concepts and viewpoints in China. In their summary, they write the following. In 2003, the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee and the Central Military Commission approved the concept of three warfares, a People's Liberation Army information warfare concept aimed at preconditioning key areas of competition in its favor. As defined by the U.S. Department of Defense in its 2011 annual report to Congress on military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China, three warfares consist of the following: psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. Note, the three warfares doctrine is official CCP policy. To get a glimpse of how this policy is implemented, here is a clip from another interview with Joshua Phillip explaining how this policy works.
Adopted into the Chinese regime's military doctrine is the three warfares concept. In other words, a propaganda, disinformation system based on three different areas. One is legal warfare, the manipulation of international legal systems; media warfare, the control of outlets of information, not just news outlets, but social media, any kind of forum where people could communicate would be targeted through it. And there's also psychological warfare. And psychological warfare is not necessarily lying on the surface. Psychological warfare is using any means to alter the way people perceive information so that you and I could be looking at the same set of information. We could be looking at the same collection of facts and come to wildly different conclusions based on those. That is the purpose of psychological warfare.
As you can see, the tactics employed by the CCP against Taiwan are clearly represented in the Three Warfares Doctrine. I'm arguing that this is not a coincidence. What we are seeing here is the implementation of the concepts we have seen expressed in Unrestricted Warfare. Taiwan, however, is not the only target of the CCP's new style of warfare. Given that the Three Warfares Doctrine represents official foreign policy, I believe this offensive is global in nature. I'm going to expand upon this point in the next section. However, before I do that, I want to give you a sense of the scale at which I believe the CCP is waging this war. To achieve that, here is another excerpt from the same interview in which Philip describes some of the other tools the CCP has at its disposal.
The CCP has other branches for this. Of course, propaganda department, the official one, 50-cent army, army of internet trolls. And when it comes to the political realm, they have, for example, the liaison department, which is it operates under the general political department, which is the political warfare branch of the Chinese military. And so when it comes to influencing politicians, the realm of politics, they use the liaison department for that. They also have different networks for high-level influence, 2 of them, in fact, at least. One of them being the Committee of 100, which is a group of high-level influencers in the United States, for example, who can write op-eds in news outlets, who can write, papers and so on, and defend the Chinese regime's positions. They also have the United Front Work Department, which operates through its consulates in different countries, a lot of times through from the consulates, managing through the Chinese Tongs or hometown associations, which can work as the grassroots voices of the regime in different parts of the world. And so they maintain this entire very large system guided by different forms of policies and, of course, state controls.
To understand why I believe the CCP's unrestricted warfare is a global offensive, consider the following. At the 19th Party Congress in 2007, Xi Jinping used a quote from Mao Zedong to explain the role of the CCP in China. Government, military, society and schools, north, south, east, and west, the party rules everything. To grasp the implications of this statement, recall that the PRC is not a national army, but the armed wing of the CCP. Chinese state media are not state-owned, but party-owned, with the controlling share belonging to the CCP's propaganda department. Private businesses in China are required to establish party cells. In this article from 2007, Reuters states that party organizations exist in nearly 70% of some 1.86 million privately owned companies. This rule is now being applied to foreign firms. One senior executive whose company was represented at the meeting told Reuters that some companies were under political pressure to revise the terms of their joint ventures with state-owned partners to allow the party final say over business operations and investment decisions. If Chinese businesses and media conglomerates are extensions of the CCP, doesn't that imply that they exist to further the CCP's interests? If they exist to further the CCP's interests, doesn't that imply that they are weapons of war? If they are weapons of war, doesn't that imply that Chinese businessmen and journalists are soldiers? We've already seen examples of this being the case in Taiwan. This is how our 2 authors put it. Obviously, warfare is in the process of transcending the domains of soldiers, military units, and military affairs, and is increasingly becoming a matter for politicians, scientists, and even bankers. How to conduct war is obviously no longer a question for the consideration of military people alone. Precisely in the same way that modern technology is changing weapons and the battlefield, it is also at the same time blurring the concept of who the war participants are. From now on, soldiers no longer have a monopoly on war. Let's take this a step further. If politicians can be viewed as soldiers, what does that imply about the citizens who employ them? If the media is an instrument of war, what is that weapon aimed at? Once again, Philip provides us with some insightful commentary.
Really, when it comes down to it, when you're dealing with free countries, everything is directed by perception. Because the basis of independent countries, of free countries, is that the people themselves decide the outcome, right? If they vote for the politicians, they can vote to a large extent for the policies, determining, in terms of who they vote for. Public opinion is what directs a lot of things, and of course, politics are privy to public opinion to a large extent. They have to follow it, at least to a pretty large extent, unless they don't want to get reelected. And so, in other words, the basis of free societies is an informed public making decisions. And so information is a huge, huge part of that.
The reason why unrestricted warfare is a global offensive is because the CCP's primary goal is to become the global hegemon. If they can convince citizens in countries all over the world to adopt the China model as their mode of governance by manipulating the information they are presented, then they will have already won World War III without ever needing to fire a single shot. If they can subvert the global institutions governing international relations, then they can leverage their influence to achieve virtually any goal, and no single nation or group of people will have the power to oppose them. In this conflict, you and I are the soldiers fighting on the front lines. In this war, there is no essential difference between wielding a gun, casting a vote, writing an article, or producing a video. That is the reason why understanding the concepts laid out in this book are so important. As Sun Tzu once wrote, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Well, now you know what you are a part of and what the stakes are. Now you know that you are fighting. As my brother or sister in arms, I officially welcome you to the
resistance. Vicious attackers, no longer victims. My apocalyptic visions got me paranoid and tripping. Try to conquer us with division, take away freedoms and put us in prison. Use misinformation to sway our opinions, but we the resistance has risen.